What up, gamers? I'm Aaron. So, if you're a melee player and I asked you what the biggest difficulty you have in keys right now is, you'd probably say one of two things. The first one might be a target cap. To you, a pull like this looks more like this. It's like a weird, messed up reverse dragonfly situation. But maybe you're a generational damage dealer. You don't care if they cap you even harder, but you just can't get into groups. You know, all these group leaders, they don't want nice guys or girls like you. They just want these Chad arcane mages and balance druids. Well, you're in luck, because the melee meta is looking more and more likely by the day. Both tanks and both healers that the melee meta might want to run are looking insane on the PTR. And basically any flavor of melee is doing good damage. Enhance, Frost, Havoc, you name it, it's probably pretty solid. But what if I told you that the melee meta had already started? Today, weeks out from any balance changes. You'd probably say I'm crazy, but hear me out, I promise this is gonna make sense. So, for pretty much the entirety of this season, we've watched some form of the wizard comp dominate. And really, that's been a lot of the last couple seasons too. And because of that consistent success, a lot of people probably assume that that's what they should play if they want to succeed. Sometimes that has been the case, but let me run you through some of this comp's major downsides so you can start to see why melee is probably preferable even right now. You see, the wizard comp at its core is all about strong cooldowns. Something like an arcane mage, it does 10 times the damage in its burst that it does outside of it. So you have these really high highs and then you sort of tickle enemies until they die. And this is pretty consistent among most things you play in this comp. Unholy, balance, pretty much anything that would go in there. So when you have these super high highs, you need to make sure you squeeze as much of the dungeon into those moments as you possibly can. And this means doing crazy pulls of 10, 15, even 20 mobs. It's considerably more dangerous, but if you split it into two groups, it's going to take twice as many sets of cooldowns. Now, if you pair these giant pulls with the fact that ranged classes have long cooldowns on their interrupts, there is no way that they can successfully interrupt 15 mobs at a time. So this is where the stop meta that we've had for a couple years comes into play. If you don't have enough interrupts, you need to use your disruptive abilities to instead delay casts, sometimes upwards of 45 seconds until the pack starts dying. This is why you hear things like, in high keys, if one cast goes off, you're dead. Realistically, you can live one cast, especially with a defensive, but a lot of the time, if one of these goes off, 15 of them are going off, and that is unsurvivable for anybody. Now let's take a look at melee, and I really want to sell you on this. So, because these guys are target capped, they realistically can't do the giant pulls that the wizard comp can. But they have two serious advantages. The first one is that they have way shorter interrupt cooldowns. The average for a melee is about 12 to 15 seconds, whereas for ranged, it's about 24 to 45, and some of them don't even have a kick. So the second major advantage is that they have a way flatter damage curve, which means that while they don't have the incredibly high highs, they never have as low of lows either. So as long as you keep pulling, even though your pulls are smaller, you're getting tons of value in the time that you do damage, while another class might just be waiting for cooldowns. And these smaller pulls, a lot of the time, are considerably safer and reduce your chances of wiping to a big pull by a huge margin. These two different comps aren't just A and B. It's not just I prefer this or I prefer that. One of them is objectively easier. No disrespect to melee players, they have their own challenges and some of their pulls are hard for completely different reasons. But for a lot of packs, it's as simple as just kick the mobs. If you were to compare this to something easy to digest like Mario Kart, Wizard Comp is racing down Rainbow Road, whereas the melee are just cruising through Moo Moo Meadows. They're still playing for the exact same cup. I mean, they have the same leaderboard, they're going for the same Mythic Plus title, and the Keystone Master happens at the exact same IO. But, you know, wizards have to learn how to not fall into the void of space, and all melee has to do is just make sure they don't hit the giant cows in the road. Okay, so I've pulled up MDT so I can show you the difference in the difficulty of these comps pulls. This is the first pull of Priory with a wizard comp, and this isn't just some crazy route. This is viable all the way up to 20s and beyond. Now we all know this first boss, Suleiman. He is going to, every 15 to 20 seconds, thunderclap and nearly one-shot your entire party. he alone is already pretty dangerous. But while dealing with him, the caster comp also has to deal with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mobs that are going to be chain casting, and they do not have enough interrupts for this. So, while dealing with the thunderclaps, the wizard comp also needs to perfectly execute a CC rotation. And as if that wasn't enough, there are 3 sharpshooters in this pull, which are going to be taking huge chunks out of your teammates' health, especially cloth wearers, which have no way to mitigate this physical hit. And additionally, because casters are ranged, if any of your team isn't stacked in melee, then these sharpshooters are just going to jump out and risk either pulling new mobs or just, not taking any damage for the entirety of the pull. But let's flip it over to Fizz comp to show you what they might be doing. Now, it looks like about the same amount of mobs, but really, this is considerably easier for a couple reasons. We're still fighting the mini-boss, obviously, but our classes are a little more durable overall, so it's not quite as big a deal. Most of the mobs we're pulling here are footmen, which are just going to hit the tank. The only things that your team needs to actually worry about are the only 2 casters. And keep in mind, we have 4 to 5 melee kit cooldowns, so 2 casters is nothing. There are still 2 sharpshooters, but your team is wearing higher armor, so the physical hits are not going to be nearly as dangerous. And because everybody is already stacked in melee, the sharpshooters are just going to jump in and get cleaved down already. It's pretty much a night and day difference in the difficulty of these pulls. And that's not to say melee never does anything difficult. I mean, if you wanted to scale this into a 21 key, you might start doing things that are a little crazy, like chainmail into the shield mini-boss, but again, that's something that you don't need to do until beyond title. So really, for 99% of people, you are going to have a much easier time doing these pulls with the Fizz comp than you will with casters. So when you invite casters and you fill your group with them, you are adding 800 fail points to every single pull in the dungeon. If the mage or demon hunter are 1 GCD late on their stops, somebody's dying. If the druid misses their beam, that's almost unrecoverable. But with melee, one person fucking up is way more forgivable, and a lot of the times it's perfectly recoverable, and that should always be preferred in a chaotic pug situation. So let's say I'm right. Well, what's gonna happen to our beautiful meta? Well, I'll give you my prediction in the form of a quick history lesson. So, back in the before times of Battle for Azeroth, the meta was way more melee focused than it is today. We even had a triple rogue season. But the idea of dropping one of these melee kicks was not taken lightly. You might think of Fire Mage when you think back to that time, but remember that didn't really take off until late into the Corruption season, once they started just obliterating packs with their Ignite. Now, the Wizard comp did exist in a viable state from as early as the start of Shadowlands, but we didn't see it really hit the ground running until Augmentation Evoker came out and made every melee shit at the exact same time. So, when you see people saying things like, oh, the meta is going to be VDH, Mage, and Priest for all time, that's kind of a ridiculous statement because that meta is relatively quite young. And speaking of quite young, Battle for Azeroth actually came out 7 years ago, so if you remember that time, I hope you did your stretches this morning. So my assumption is that once the top group on Raider IO is melee comp for even just a couple weeks, we are going to see a generational whiplash, the likes of which we haven't seen since classic players went from complaining about the game being too easy to the game being too hard. And the reason for this is that even if these specs are all worse, like you could argue they are today, the strategies and the routes are so much more accessible and easy to execute that 99% of all players should have a better time playing with melee comps than they would trying to learn to fly with wizards. So if you're impatient and don't want to wait for this community shift, you can start being that shift today. There are armies of melee players that would love to play the game, but there aren't too many groups building for full physical comp. I myself played wizard comp this season, so I know they're out there because every time I would list a key, they're like mosquitoes on your window. There's just 800 Ret Paladins and Feral Druids right outside, watching and begging for an invite. They would love to play with you. So if you start familiarizing yourself with, what the melee comps want and how to build one for optimal raid buff coverage, you are going to start getting IO at a much higher rate than if you try to force yourself into the God comp, because that just doesn't work for anybody. Now I realize it would be YouTube malpractice for me to tell you to look into these comps without just telling you how to build them right here. So I'm going to run you through the quick guidelines to making a melee friendly comp. Now, the first one is that not every spec actually has to be melee. They just have to have goals that align with melee specs. If you invite something like an Unholy DK that wants the biggest pulls imaginable, then your 8 target capped Outlaw Rogue is going to be pretty pissed. So just make sure that everyone that you bring has a very cohesive idea on how they want to play the key. The second thing is to stack as many raid buffs as you can that actually benefit melee. Things like Battle Shout, Mark of the Wild, and Sky Fury are just universally loved. If you do a lot of physical damage, bring a Mystic Touch. Magic damage, you can throw in a Demon Hunter. But just make sure you bring something that people actually like, because if you bring something nobody wants like an Arcane Intellect, your group is going to look at you the way that your uncle would look at a case of Bud Light. And finally, the third one is to try to make sure that everybody in your group has a relatively low kick cooldown. It's okay if you have like a Hunter at 24 seconds, but anything longer than that, and some of the sort of foundational strategies to the comp are gonna sort of start to break down. Beyond that though, just kind of bring whoever you know that doesn't break any of the other rules and does good damage. You have way more flexibility with this kind of comp than something like the God comp, where everybody has to have perfect synergy and be good at 20 target pulls. Anyways, I myself am actually going to be healing for a melee comp team next season, which is a really big change for me, but it's one that I'm actually really excited about. But if you'd rather just chill until the patch, that's totally understandable, and I'd like to throw at you that my last couple videos kind of flopped, so if you're interested in helping me preserve my fragile ego, I would really appreciate it if you'd check out some of my other content. Anyways, thank you so much for your time. My name is Aaron. Peace. If you or a loved one have been declined to a +5 for being a shitty spec, you may be entitled to IO compensation.